The storm had no mercy that night. It came not with rage but with certainty, covering the forest in silence so thick it swallowed even the sound of breath. Wind threaded through pine needles like a warning, and snow fell in slow spirals, patient, relentless. Deep within that white quiet, a cabin stood, small, weathered, alone. Inside, Leia moved like someone used to absence. She had lived too long in rooms that forgot how to echo. The fire burned low, casting shadows that stretched more than they warmed. Her hands were calloused from wood and worry, her heart quieter than either. Then came the knock, not loud, not desperate. Just 3 even taps like someone asking permission without expectation. She froze. Fear rose first, then memory, then instinct. No one came here, especially not in storms. Another knock, slower now. As if the knocker already knew her hesitation and had decided to wait. She crossed the room, each step echoing against old floorboards and older doubts. Through the glass, blurred by frost, she saw them. A man tall, soaked through, holding a child curled against his chest. A stranger. And a boy, clearly ill, small against the man's body, his face pressed to a damp coat sleeve. Leia didn't move. The space between her and the door was only a few feet, but it might as well have been a lifetime. She had once opened a door like this, and paid for it in pieces of herself she never fully got back. But something about the man's stillness, his refusal to beg, his patience, undid her logic. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't. She unlatched the door, slowly. The cold hit first, then the scent of wet pine, then the truth. This man had nowhere else to go. One night, she said, her voice low but firm, he nodded, grateful without leaning into it. That's how it began, not with promises, but with firelight and silence, and a door she never thought she'd open again. The wind that evening didn't howl, it whispered. Slow, deliberate, pressing through the seams of old wood like a memory trying to find its way back in. Snow drifted like ash, and the trees held their breath. Inside a small cabin tucked into the slope of a forgotten hill, Leia stood perfectly still, her spine straight yet brittle, like a branch one storm away from snapping. She hadn't had a visitor in months, not since she learned the difference between silence and safety. The knock came not with urgency but with rhythm, 3 taps, then stillness. As if the person on the other side knew panic would only deepen her refusal. She waited. When the knock came again, soft, measured, she moved. Slow steps, measured breath. The fire behind her threw flickers of orange against the dark pine walls, but its warmth never quite reached her. Through the frosted glass she saw them. A man standing like a statue carved from exhaustion, holding a child whose small limbs curled into his chest. They looked like something the storm had forgotten, a pair exiled from comfort. He didn't knock again. He simply waited. That more than anything unnerved her. She opened the door just wide enough to be cautious. "We need shelter," the man said, voice low. "Just for the night." His coat hung open, exposing the boy's pale face, flushed with fever. Snow clung to their hair, their sleeves, their lashes. Leia's instincts coiled tight. She opened a door once, long ago, and it had taken her years to close it again. Still, her gaze fell on the boy's lips, blue at the edges, and something deeper than reason stirred. "One night," she said flat. The man nodded. "Thank you." He stepped inside as though he were entering a cathedral. Not a glance around. No attempt to explain. He moved directly to the fire, knelt, and laid the boy across the couch with a reverence that made her chest ache. "I'm David," he said, unbuttoning his coat and folding it around the child. "This is Eli." She didn't respond. Instead, she walked to the cupboard, retrieved a towel, and tossed it toward him without making eye contact. "Dry him off. Stay near the fire. Don't touch anything else." There was no need for softness. Softness had betrayed her once. Now she preferred rules, clear, rigid, measurable. David caught the towel midair and nodded again, silent. He began to dry the boy's damp curls with movements that felt more like memory than motion. Leia returned to her place near the window, arms folded, watching. The boy stirred, coughing, a dry, raspy rattle that echoed through the room like truth. David whispered something, but the boy didn't wake. He simply curled tighter, trusting warmth that Leia hadn't offered. She didn't know whether to feel threatened or guilty. Time thickened, slowed. The air, though warm from the fire, sat heavy with unsaid things. David stayed quiet, not withdrawn, not afraid, just still. The kind of stillness that speaks fluently in grief. "You have somewhere to go tomorrow?" She asked, not because she cared, but because silence had started pressing too hard against the walls. "We'll find somewhere," he replied. Not an answer, but enough. That night the cabin was divided by more than wood and air. On one side, a man and a child curled into the hush of survival. On the other, a woman holding a fire poker as though it were the last piece of certainty she had. What she didn't know was this. Some distances are measured not in feet, but in the weight of memories between two people. And that night the gap between them, though small in space, was miles in meaning. Yet something, barely perceptible. The silence wasn't passive. It had weight, shape, intent. It didn't rest between them like an accident. It settled with precision, pressing into corners, nestling in the creak of floorboards and the soft rustle of a coat being removed. This was not the quiet of peace, but of calculation. Leia sat on the far edge of the room, barely blinking, her fingers wrapped tightly around a mug she didn't drink from. Every inhale was measured, every blink a choice. David moved like a man familiar with the rules of borrowed space. He didn't ask for more. He didn't explain who he was, or why he had a black card buried in his pocket instead of a backpack with food or medicine. He only focused on Eli, removing his shoes with gentle hands, peeling damp socks from tiny feet, then tucking the boy in with that coat again, worn now like a second skin over shivering bones. To Leia it was too quiet, too still. He didn't fidget. He didn't pace. He didn't look at her more than once. That absence of demand made her more anxious than any threat might have. She was used to intrusion wrapped in charm, cruelty hiding behind smiles. But this man, he brought nothing. No story, no requests, only stillness, and a child too quiet to fake. The fire crackled, small, sharp sounds in a room wound tight. The mug in Leia's hand began to tremble not from temperature, but from the weight of what she couldn't explain. What kind of man wanders into a storm with a child and carries himself like he's already survived worse? She tried to watch Eli instead, but the boy slept too soundly for someone in pain. Maybe exhaustion had won. Maybe trust came easier to children. Maybe he was simply used to falling asleep wherever warmth could be borrowed. David adjusted the blanket. Not once did he touch his phone. Not once did he check the time. He moved as if time had stopped meaning anything. That unsettled her most of all. The men she had known clung to minutes, to exit plans, to whatever lay just beyond the door. David didn't. "Do you do this often?" she asked finally. His eyes met hers, not evasive, not defensive, just clear. "No." "Walk into strangers' homes." "I don't make a habit of it, but tonight wasn't about me." The way he said it, quiet, almost apologetic, made her flinch. She hadn't expected humility. She didn't know what to do with it. Her instinct was to press harder, interrogate, strip the story to its bones, but something in his gaze stopped her. Not fear, not evasion, just a tiredness so complete it felt sacred. She looked back at the fire and for the first time realized her own breathing had softened. David settled back against the wall beside the couch, one hand resting gently on Eli's back. No tension, no pretense, just presence. It was the kind of energy that didn't seek approval, that didn't provoke or perform, and it disarmed her more effectively than words ever could. The room remained quiet, but now the silence carried a different weight, not suspicion, but the beginning of understanding. A fragile pause in two lives shaped by noise, control, and loss. Stillness wasn't absence. It was the It was nearly midnight, but time inside the cabin didn't obey clocks. It moved according to breath, to glances, to the flicker of flame across worn floorboards. Leia stood near the linen chest, her fingers hovering over folded fabric like someone choosing a memory instead of a blanket. Most of what she owned had been second-hand. This one was. It was soft, hand-stitched, carried the scent of cedar and nights when she used to believe warmth could be kept. She didn't speak. She just walked over and placed it on the edge of the couch, not too close, not too casual. The gesture was simple, but the weight of it, the trust, the risk, was anything but. David looked at her, not with surprise, but with the kind of recognition that didn't need words. He nodded once. Then carefully, as though the blanket were breakable, he drew it over Eli's sleeping body. His movements weren't hurried. They were deliberate, almost reverent. Then came the moment she wasn't ready for. He took the towel she'd given him earlier, now damp from snow and fever sweat, and folded it, not sloppily, not absently, but with quiet attention, corner to corner, smoothing the fabric as if returning a favor he hadn't yet named. Leia felt something shift, not in the room, in her. It was the way his hands moved, measured, almost ceremonial. Folding wasn't about tidiness. It was a kind of care, a respect for space, for the gift of being let in, however temporarily. She'd known men who acted grateful with their mouths but left messes behind as proof they'd never planned to stay. David's silence said he knew he might not be welcome again, so he left behind only folded gratitude. She turned away, not out of indifference, but to protect something stirring too soon. Her back to him, she pretended to rearrange the kettle, but her hands trembled slightly, not from cold. How many times had she longed for kindness that didn't come with strings? How often had she mistaken noise for care, proximity for protection? And now, this stranger offered no explanations, no assurances, just a folded towel, a warm child, and silence that didn't press for more. She sat down, slower this time, not across the room but closer to the fire's reach, still guarded but no longer distant. The cabin, once divided by invisible walls, felt a little less fractured. David didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't react. He remained beside his son, adjusting the blanket, brushing hair from Eli's forehead with a tenderness too quiet to perform. Leah watched from the corner of her eye, unblinking. In another world, perhaps, that gesture would have passed unnoticed. But in this one, in her world of alarm bells and drawn lines, it cracked something open. Not entirely, not loudly, but enough to let air in, enough to let something soften. Kindness, she realized, isn't always grand. Sometimes it's the quiet folding of what's been used, the warmth. By morning, the storm hadn't passed. If anything, it had settled deeper, blanketing the world outside in white silence, so thick it muffled even the birds. The trees looked frozen mid-thought. The wind had become less violent but more persistent, like something that had made up its mind to stay. Leah opened the door just enough to see. Snow drifts as high as the porch rail. The path to the road was erased. She didn't say anything to David, but he knew. She could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed, not out of comfort, but because the question of departure had been answered by nature itself. They would stay another night. There was no discussion, no renegotiation, only motion. David stood and stretched the stiffness from his back. "I can help with the wood pile," he said simply. Leah nodded. "Axe is near the shed, don't stray." He didn't. He moved through her space like someone stepping through sacred ground, careful, alert, but not apologetic. And somehow in that stillness, a new rhythm began to shape itself. Without ceremony, without plan, they divided the day. David gathered and split firewood. Leah cooked rice and broth. She opened the windows slightly to air the cabin, while he fixed the loose hinge on the back door. At one point, he borrowed a nail from her tool jar, left the lid exactly where he found it. At another, he asked if Eli could drink ginger tea. She said yes without looking up. Eli slept through most of it, occasionally stirring but never crying. When he woke, he sat on David's lap and watched Leah move around the cabin with wide eyes, like watching something rare and careful. By afternoon, the light had shifted, softer, slower. David helped Leah move the heavier logs near the fireplace. She didn't ask. He didn't wait. It was the kind of teamwork that didn't need affirmation. Their hands brushed once, reaching for the same piece of wood. They didn't comment, just kept going. Later, they found themselves at the table, eating without ceremony. Just two adults and a child sharing warmth and salt and something else unspoken. It didn't feel like hospitality anymore. It felt like something older, familiar, as though this routine had once belonged to them in another life. That evening, Leah brought out paper and scissors for Eli. The boy made snowflakes, then cut out shapes of people, placing them in a row across the table. "This one's Dad, this one's me," he said, pointing. Then paused, lifting one more. "This one's you." He handed it to Leah, unblinking. She took it unsure what to say. Something in her chest, long since frozen, stirred. David said nothing, but the way he looked at his son, soft pride, gentle ache, said enough. That night the cabin was quieter but not heavy. The silence didn't sit between them. It stretched over them like a blanket neither had to claim. They didn't speak of tomorrow, didn't ask what came next. But as the fire burned low and the wind sang softer, they sat near each other, not close, not apart, just present. And in the hush of that second night, the lines between stranger, guest, and something else entirely began to blur, not by declaration. The following morning unfolded not with drama, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of care. Leah rose early, not because sleep had failed her, but because something quieter, something human, had begun to ask for her presence. The cabin was still. Snow blanketed the windows in a hush. The only sound was the soft breath of a child tangled in a wool blanket. Eli stirred, coughing lightly, a rasp woven into his breath. David remained asleep beside him, one hand resting protectively on the boy's back. Leah stood by the stove, already heating water, not for herself, not from habit, but for him. She prepared ginger tea, light broth, a towel soaked in warm water. She moved through these motions not mechanically, but intuitively, the way a person does when their body remembers a kind of care they were once denied. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She simply acted the way wind bends trees without permission. Eli opened his eyes slowly, uncertain. His gaze found her. At first he looked past her, searching for his father. But when she knelt beside him with a cup of warm liquid, his shoulders loosened, not with full trust, but with the absence of fear. David woke moments later and said nothing. He watched instead. Watched as Leah held the cup to Eli's lips, as she wiped his forehead with the cloth, as she hummed, barely audible, a tune she didn't know she remembered. There was no maternal performance, no sudden intimacy, just presence, attention. A woman who understood that the smallest acts often carry the most sacred weight. David's chest tightened, not with suspicion, not with jealousy, but with something he hadn't felt in a long time: relief. The silent, aching kind that comes when you realize, maybe for the first time, you don't have to do this alone. He saw in her a mirror, not of circumstance, but of soul. Someone who had known absence so deeply they had turned it into awareness. Every gesture she offered Eli wasn't just kindness. It was reparation for herself, for the boy, maybe even for him. After breakfast, Eli sat up on his own. His fever had ebbed. He looked toward Leah before speaking, not as if asking permission, but seeking confirmation. That small shift, a child turning toward a new adult for grounding, spoke louder than any thank you. David and Leah met, eyes across the room. It wasn't a romantic glance, not a spark, not a tease. It was something slower, heavier. The recognition that between them a bridge had been built, not through conversation, but through care, not by choice, but by the soft gravity of shared responsibility. In that quiet morning, beneath the ticking clock and simmering pot, 3 people, 2 strangers and a boy, had begun to shift in orbit. No declarations, no plans. Just a space where something unspoken began to live. Not trust, not... The snow had stopped by mid-afternoon. The sky outside remained colorless, like paper waiting to be written on. Inside the cabin, the air had shifted again, not warmer but gentler. The kind of softness that comes not from temperature, but from time spent in shared stillness. Leia brought out paper and a worn box of crayons from an old drawer, more out of instinct than planning. She set them on the table and didn't explain. Children don't need instructions for imagination. They only need permission. Eli approached quietly, curiosity outweighing shyness. He pulled himself onto the chair, picked up a crayon, and began. David watched from across the room, saying nothing. Leia pretended to busy herself with folding blankets, but her eyes, too, kept returning to the boy. He drew with the solemn focus of someone trying to remember, not create. First came the outline of the cabin, a crooked rectangle with smoke rising. Then a tall figure holding a smaller one. The man, himself. And then slowly, carefully, he drew a third figure at the doorway. A woman, one hand on the knob, the other extended. No face, just the gesture, the moment. He used a yellow crayon to fill the space around her, making the doorway glow like light breaking through storm clouds. Leia stopped folding. David leaned in, quietly stunned. When Eli finished, he slid off the chair and handed the paper to Leia without ceremony. "This is when you open the door," he said. "It made everything better." Leia took the drawing as if it were glass, afraid the weight of her hands might crumple something so fragile, so vast. She looked at it, not with judgment, but with a kind of reverence usually reserved for altars. Something about the way he had drawn her, not central, not grand, but illuminated, unlocked a door in her that had remained closed for years. She hadn't known she was someone's warmth. She hadn't considered that a single gesture, a cracked open door, could anchor someone else's sense of safety. Without speaking, she crossed the room and pinned the drawing to the cabin wall. It wasn't straight. The edges curled. The paper was too thin to hold its own, and still it stayed. David stood beside her, his voice low. "He never draws people," he said. She didn't answer. Words would have diminished the moment. They stood there, three bodies in a room made larger by memory, looking at a child's version of truth. A home drawn from nothing. A threshold made sacred. A woman once broken, now immortalized in crayon, not as savior, but as shelter. The drawing remained on the wall long after the crayons were put away. It didn't match the decor. It wasn't art by any standard, but it was the only picture that had ever made the cabin feel like a home. And in that still frame, hung by quiet hands, a new story had begun to take root. Not one written in chapters, but in presence. Not in plot, but in place. The morning arrived too quietly. The light outside the window was diffused gray, the kind of morning where the sky forgets to warm the earth. Inside, the fire had burned low, embers pulsing beneath ash. Leia stretched, not with restfulness but with the instinct of someone who'd grown used to waking up alone. And then she noticed the difference. The room was too still, no weight in the air, no shuffle of a child's feet, no scent of fresh tea or movement near the door, just absence, pure, uncut, and immediate. She stepped into the main room. The couch was empty. The folded blanket still bore the shape of a small body now gone. On the table sat a plain envelope and something that glinted dark in the early light. A black card. No name. No logo. Just sleek weight, the kind reserved for those whose access was never questioned. Her hand hovered above it, uncertain whether to pick it up or leave it untouched, as if touching it would confirm something she wasn't ready to admit. She opened the envelope first. It wasn't long. Just 5 lines, written in a steady, careful hand. Thank you for the warmth, the safety, the silence. You gave us more than shelter. You gave us pause, and for that I'll always be grateful. No name, no promise, no explanation. She stood there, letter in hand, heart pacing inside a silence so full it rang. Gone just like that, not stolen, not taken, simply. Disappeared. She didn't cry, that wasn't her reflex. She cleaned, she cleared the cups, smoothed the couch, folded the blanket as if it would bring them back. She left the card on the table, untouched, like a relic too powerful to claim. The cabin now felt larger, not because they were gone, but because something had expanded while they were there, and now lingered in the empty spaces. It wasn't abandonment. It wasn't betrayal. It was a silence that carried the weight of something unspoken, something unfinished. A threshold had been crossed, and she hadn't noticed until the door had closed behind it. She sat down at the table, the drawing still pinned to the wall behind her. The crayon yellow glow in that paper doorway seemed to mock the grayness of her present. She ran her fingers over the card. Cold, smooth, impersonal. But the gesture was. She wasn't grieving the loss of people. She was grieving the shape she had begun to take while they were here. The version of herself that had emerged in shared space, in acts of care, in trust given inch by inch. And now, with no goodbye, that shape had no mirror to reflect in. It wasn't heartbreak, it was interruption, and that somehow hurt more. The snow began to melt in slow confession. Icicles loosened one drop at a time, like time itself unraveling. Roads reappeared, birds remembered their songs. But inside the cabin, winter lingered in quieter ways. Leia hadn't touched the black card since that morning. It stayed on the table, a dark anchor in a room trying to forget. Days passed without rhythm. Tasks filled space but not time. She chopped wood, heated soup, aired blankets. But nothing settled the question that now pulsed at the back of her thoughts. Why leave without a word? When the silence began to shift from emptiness to ache, she tucked the card into her coat pocket and walked into town. The bank smelled sterile. Polished, precise. The kind of place where everything is labeled except intent. She approached the teller, unsure what to say. She didn't know if the card would even register. But when it slid across the counter, the woman on the other side straightened slightly. "May I ask who gave you this?" Leia hesitated. "A traveler," she replied. "He left it behind." The woman typed, paused, typed again. Her face shifted from neutral to careful. "This isn't a regular account," she said gently. "There are holdings here, significant ones." Leia swallowed. The air inside the bank felt thinner than the mountain cold. "I don't need the money," she said. "I just wanted to know if it was real." The woman nodded, studying her. "It's real." Leia took the card back, tucked it into her coat, and left before anything else could be said. Back at the cabin, everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. She didn't need wealth. What she craved, what gnawed at her, was the story. The why, the meaning, the part of the conversation they never had. What had brought a man like that, with access and power and means, to her doorstep in a storm? And more haunting still, why had he left without letting her name what they had begun? She sat by the fire with the drawing still on the wall, her tea untouched. The steam curled upward like a question with no mark at the end. The room wasn't empty, not truly. The absence had begun to speak its own language. It told her that presence doesn't end with departure. That silence, when earned, can linger longer than words. She began to live among ghosts, not haunting ones, but the kind that sit with you in quiet moments, not to frighten, but to remind. The sound of wood shifting in the stove, the way the light hit the floor at dusk, the echo of a child's cough in her memory. She kept the card, but she didn't use it. What she wanted couldn't be purchased. She wanted to understand why the thing she never asked for had felt more like home than anything she'd ever built, and whether he might one day return not as a storm, but as a sentence finally finished. It didn't arrive in an envelope that stood out. No golden seal, no courier knocking twice. Just a letter, folded with care, slipped into her rusted mailbox on a Tuesday when the clouds looked undecided and the birds had stopped announcing things. Leia almost didn't open it. She assumed it was another service notice or one of those hollow pre-approvals she never requested. But the return address stopped her hand. R and Holdings. She'd seen that name before. Somewhere in town, etched in glass on a polished door she never had reason to enter. She opened the letter standing barefoot in her doorway. No preamble, no signature flourish. Just a short, sharp invitation written in the kind of language that didn't ask, it welcomed. We are launching a new community initiative, the Open Door Project, based on values of trust, dignity, and healing. We would be honored to have you lead it. She read it 3 times. The name at the bottom was typed, not signed. David. There was no explanation, no mention of the cabin, no acknowledgement of the snow, the tea, the drawing, just an address. A time, a quiet door now offered to her to walk through. She sat down at the edge of her porch, letter trembling slightly in her hands. It wasn't shock. It wasn't joy. It was something older, quieter, recognition. He hadn't reached out to thank her. He'd reached out to include her, not as a symbol, not as a story, but as someone he had seen in action, under stress, in truth, without pretense. Someone who, in his eyes, didn't just offer help in a storm, but embodied the ethic behind it. That night in the cabin hadn't been a test, but it had become a threshold, a lens, a blueprint. He had watched her move without ego, respond without calculation, care without needing reward. And now, months later, he wasn't offering money or apology. He was offering continuity. She folded the letter carefully. It didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like a beginning she had somehow already stepped into without knowing. The drawing still hung on the wall behind her. The doorway Eli had colored in yellow now pulsed with new meaning. She would go, not for answers, but because she finally understood that what had happened in that cabin wasn't an interruption, it was a calling. The building was all glass and steel, edges clean, light calculated. A far cry from the smoke-softened cabin tucked in winter's palm. Yet as Leia stepped into the lobby of R and Holdings, her pulse didn't race. It slowed. Not from fear, but from memory. She told herself this was a meeting. Just that. She told herself she didn't care if he remembered the exact moment she handed him a blanket, or how she'd watched him fold a towel as if it held meaning. But when the elevator opened and she saw him standing there, waiting, not with formality, but with stillness, every word she'd rehearsed melted behind her ribs. David looked the same. Not in clothing, his suit was tailored, his shoes shined, but in posture, in presence. Still that same man who had crouched beside a fire, letting silence speak for him. Still that father who had said more with the way he touched his son's back than most men did in entire conversations. "Thank you for coming," he said. She nodded, but didn't reply. The elevator doors closed, and for a few seconds it was just them. Her breath, his silence, the echo of a snowstorm neither had spoken of since. When the doors opened again, he didn't lead her into a boardroom. He brought her to a smaller space, walls lined with sketches, notes, mock-ups. In the center, a table with a single project name printed across the top, the Open Door Initiative. He gestured to the seat across from his. "We've spent months building this," he said, "but it won't work without you." She sat, not out of politeness, but because her legs knew something her pride hadn't caught up to. He continued, "It's not charity. It's structure for people who live between systems, like you, like me, before I inherited titles I didn't earn." She looked at the materials, outreach models, transitional housing plans, mentorship networks, not abstract policy, practical dignity. "You didn't just offer us shelter," he said, more quietly now. "You modeled what we're trying to scale, not just warmth, but unspoken permission to be human again." The words landed not like flattery, but like truth, unexpected, exacting. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She only said, "Why me?" His answer was immediate. "Because you didn't ask for anything, and still you gave everything." In that glass tower beneath skylights and fluorescent strategy, the firelight of that forgotten night seemed to flicker again between them. The ballroom was gilded in curated elegance, crystal chandeliers, white linen, music that knew how to disappear behind conversation. Faces moved past each other like gentle tides, every smile rehearsed, every handshake coded. It was a night designed for visibility, and yet Leia felt invisible, not unseen but unclaimed. A quiet presence in a room built for declarations. She had attended only because the team asked her to. Because the Open Door Initiative was now real, offices opened, beds filled, stories heard. But the gala felt far from where it had begun. There were no fireplaces here, no drawn blankets, only wineglasses and applause cued by schedule, until David took the stage. He didn't clear his throat, didn't read from the teleprompter. He looked out at the audience, then straight toward her. "I wasn't supposed to speak tonight," he said, "but I can't let this project grow without acknowledging where it was born." Silence settled like snowfall. He continued, "Months ago, in the middle of a storm, my son and I found shelter in the home of a stranger. No questions, no judgment, just warmth and soup and quiet space to breathe." He paused, letting the memory fill the room. That night wasn't charity. It wasn't kindness for show. It was humanity lived. And it's the foundation of everything we're building. He turned then, not to the crowd, but to her. Leia didn't ask who I was. She didn't try to solve our lives. She just opened the door, and in doing so reminded me of who I wanted to become. There was no standing ovation, just a hush so absolute it felt sacred. For the first time since the cabin, Leia felt seen, not by title, not by merit, but by memory, by meaning. After the speech, people approached, voices softer, eyes more open. They no longer looked at her like an accessory to a project, but like its spine. Later, beneath soft lights and thinning crowds, David found her on the balcony. No cameras, no podium, just the man again. "Thank you," he said, not because he hadn't before, but because some thank yous need repetition to land fully. She looked at him, finally allowing a question that had sat with her for months. "Why now?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I didn't want you to think this story only mattered in private. You gave me dignity. Tonight, I wanted to return it." He didn't reach for her hand, but when she stepped closer, neither moved away. In the cool air between skyscrapers and silence, there were no fireworks, no promises. Just two people whose lives had touched before they had names for what they meant. The truth was now public, but the love, still quiet, still theirs. A year later, the snow returned, softer this time, gentler. It blanketed the trees like memory come home, layering each branch with silence that no longer threatened. The cabin stood where it always had, but now with repairs, with care, with something like permanence. David parked the car just beyond the clearing, letting the final steps be walked, not driven. Leia followed behind, Eli between them, holding both their hands. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, or maybe she had grown. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The blanket still lay folded by the hearth. The drawing faded, curling at the edges, remained pinned to the wall. The doorway Eli had once colored in gold crayon still glowed, even in the pale winter light. David turned to her. No speech, no grand gesture, just a small box held in quiet hands. He knelt, not in performance, not in tradition, but in reflection, on the very threshold where 1 year ago she had chosen to let a stranger in. Inside the box, a simple silver ring, etched on the band, "Thank you for opening the door." It wasn't a proposal in the usual sense. It was a recognition, a moment offered, not claimed. She said yes, not out loud, but in the way her hand reached for his, in the way Eli leaned into them both, his arms wrapping their waists like a ribbon of everything they'd become. No audience, no music, no fireworks. Just three people in a cabin warmed by choice. A door that had once opened to shelter a stranger, now framing a home built not by luck, but by grace. Some doors are never meant to be closed. Some chances are never just once. And some kinds of love, when given quietly, return louder than any storm.